Hello, I'm Jim Wolfe. I'm here again with Dr. Henry Stein in our third interview. Henry is the director of the Alfred Adler Institute of San Francisco. Henry, we left off our last interview talking about the creative process. You talked about analysis and saturating yourself with the case, intuitive leaps. At the end of the interview, I think the last thing we spoke about was about not being able to employ common sense in capturing the private logic of a person, and which I thought was very interesting. Perhaps you could talk more about the creative process. I'd be very interested in that.
It's a fascinating subject. It's kind of kept me interested in that discipline for a long time, and I've had to go across disciplines to discover what was studied and written about it, into the creative arts, and also into other sciences. But what I've discovered about that's special about a creative process in psychotherapy is that it's not just like in some mediums an oral thing or a visual thing. It's pretty total. And so that one has to be creative in one's thinking, in one's feeling, in one's imagining. But that there's a preparation for being creative that some people, I don't think, appreciate. They wait for creative inspiration. But I think real creativity and intuition comes as a result, in part, of doing a tremendous amount of preparation and saturating oneself with information. So that if one is working on a case, certainly one has to have this theory under one's belt. But in working on the case itself, it's like getting all this information that seems important and translating it into movement, which Adler and Sophia told us about.
Doing your homework and...
Doing your homework, but then getting it so that it begins to saturate into you in a way that's more than just the superficial knowledge. You kind of have to let it come in, for me, a number of times. And you're not sure what information is quite relevant in the beginning, so that you take in a great deal. But once you get it in front of you, then you need to, kind of organize it. But there's kind of a mystery here, okay? And the mystery is that the way this information is organized for the person, the meaning that it has, is unique. There's no two cases identical. So what you have to do, for me, in the creative process, is you kind of have to absorb everything that's known, and then you have to make a leap into the unknown, the hidden part that the person is not conscious of. They can't hand it to you. It's only implied in what they're telling you. And part of making that leap is not only being able to kind of guess at the person's goal, because they never tell you what the goal is. It's only something that you, I guess, kind of inductively and imaginatively come across. But you also have to begin to get a sense of what their personal or private logic is. That's the tough part.
So just understanding the goal isn't enough.
It's not enough, because the goal is part of the picture. The inferiority feeling or feelings is part of the picture. The antithetical scheme of apperception is part of the picture, and the private logic is part of the picture. Even the organ dialect is part of the picture. So if you look at it more like facets of a diamond, okay, it's like, yes, this is a diamond, but you turn it around and there are different facets to look at, and the beauty of it is looking eventually at all of them.
The whole diamond.
The whole diamond, but then you can't see all sides at once. You sort of have to turn it around, and that the light doesn't hit each point at the same time. So as you turn it around, you see it being glittering in its different facets. And it's the same way of looking at the lifestyle, and that is one aspect creatively of capturing it is capturing, let's say, the goal. Now, the goal can be captured in terms of an image or a metaphor. And Adler was very good at this, and Sophia would frequently do this. And that the metaphor, because it is so dramatic, or the image, because it's sort of colorful, seems to embody it beautifully. But that's only part of it. That gives you a sort of a gestalt of the whole thing. As you go in deeper, you may find that behind us and connected to it is this marvelous scheme of antithetical perception.
Perhaps you could talk about what that is.
The antithetical scheme?
Right, probably non-Adlerians who might be viewing this tape might not know what
That's a good point. The antithetical scheme is the way the individual somewhat cognitively and emotionally divides experience up into what is useful and what is not useful, and puts it into sort of categories that prompt the person to either put it in the direction of their success or their significance, which is their goal, or in the direction of what would be a failure or their insignificance, which is the inferiority feeling. So an antithetical scheme might be strong or weak. It might be beautiful
Opposites.
or ugly. They are opposites, but they are somewhat absolute opposites. So born out of an insecurity, the individual, instead of being able to conceive of a gray scale of life, a graduated scale, I would say, says, oh, it's this or it's this. It's good or bad. Most primitive societies are that way.
dichotomizing their experience.
Dichotomizing things. It's warm or it's cold. It's victory or it's defeat. You love me or you hate me, kind of thing. Now what that does is it allows the individual, without thinking about it, to sort experiences very rapidly, because it's a combination of thinking and feeling, and it's either for or against, and that will generate positive or negative feelings about it. Okay? If I think I can be famous, I get all excited, okay, even at the prospect of it. But if I become a nobody, I feel terrible, I feel haunted, kind of thing. So that could happen without analyzing it. Well, you know, what's important about being famous? Except if it's part of your scheme, and you have pictures to back it up, and there's experience to back it up, you don't examine it. And the whole point of the antithetical scheme is that it's a way of maintaining something without critical thinking, with no critical analysis. And it keeps it very firm and unyielding. It's like the law of movement. This is the way it is. And that's what allows a person to very rapidly have a strong feeling about something and to keep on course without thinking about it. Now, as you analyze a case, you may find, as I do, you sort of draw a center line, that there are maybe 8 or 10 or 12 different antithetical structures in here that are somewhat parallel. They're related, okay, but they are not identical. Okay?
Could you give some more examples of how there could be, within a lifestyle, there could be...
Okay, I'm thinking of one person right now. And
structures.
this person's antithetical scheme includes, and this is not defining the lifestyle and goal, but it's sort of the substructures beneath it, that on the top side would be being very powerful, but in her terms being powerful means being very wealthy, okay? And on the bottom side would be very powerless, which would be to be without money.
Poor.
Be poor, okay. But connected to that is another sort of antithetical scheme, which is on the plus side, or the top side, to be the one who has the advantage, okay? On the bottom side is the one who is cheated. So this person has a kind of a thing here where people do not share and come out even. You either have the advantage and you get the best of the situation, or you get cheated. Now, she has memories to back this up.
Does having the advantage mean to cheat others?
To get more than the others.
Okay.
Because this excludes the idea of an equal sharing. That does not even, see, the whole thing about antithetical scheme is it leaves a lot out. And frequently what is left out is reality, and frequently what is left out in therapy is the idea of social interest. Okay, because you don't find antithetical schemes that include cooperation.
Okay, so one person's on the top, one
Always
person's
on the bottom.
other.
One is the winner, one is the loser. One gets everything, one loses everything. But there's no antithetical scheme about, it's like sharing doesn't come into the picture.
Let me move that out of it.
Another variation on this, because it's important to get these very precise meanings because that's what you use in therapy, is this individual has an antithetical scheme of being able to get or buy whatever she wants. Okay? And on the bottom side, there's the scheme of not being able to buy what she wants. Well, she has memories where her mother wouldn't let her buy what she wanted. So now if she is very rich, she'll be able to get what she wants. If she's very poor, you see how those connect? She can't get what she wants. Now somebody else might want to be rich for a different reason. But she has this idea. So what we do is assemble these things so we have a kind of, it's almost like having a blueprint of the person's thinking. Another one of this person's antithetical schemes is to be protected or to be unprotected or victimized. Now, she believes that being protected, she will be protected if she is financially secure. Now, it was interesting because one of the things that we talked about, and she was getting ready to, she was talking about making a relationship with somebody and eventually getting married someday. One of the things that's very important to her, almost more important than falling in love, is having a prenuptial agreement financially. To avoid being cheated, to be sure she has her advantage. So you see how that begins to, right? It's not perfect fit, but it gives you issues that you can show the person that they leave something out.
It's all part of the whole person, and
yeah.
So not everybody would have dichotomized things in this way or have these particular
That's right.
issues.
They're very unique. Many people have dichotomized thinking, but their issues that they are dichotomized about are usually quite personal. This is why some people frequently get in arguments.
That brings me, it's just, at the end of the last interview, you said we have to capture this private logic.
Yeah.
And almost suspend. I'm not sure if you meant suspend common sense or you make the intuitive leap.
It's more like making a comparison. It's the idea of, in order to understand, to really penetrate, I think penetration is a better word, of the other person's thinking, you kind of have to leave your own thinking and you leave common sense and you take like a step in, which is a different form of logic about the way the world works, reasoning about why things are so. I mean, like a form of private logic that might be like, if my parents abused me, nobody else will treat me any better than that. That's a form of private logic. Okay? Or if I was the youngest and my brother was smarter and handsomer and faster than me, that if I could be better looking and faster than him, my life would be wonderful. That's a form of private logic. There are even more bizarre forms of private logic. One is a young man who thought, if I could reach a level of pure consciousness, I would be in paradise. That does not include any action. It's just pure consciousness, you see. He was somewhat schizoid, right? But that's different kinds of private logic. The thing about capturing it is you have to be willing to understand what would it be like to live this way or to think this way without criticizing it,
So,
to kind of step into it.
So you're talking about empathy now as
The
part
combination of empathy, but the empathy is the emotional side. The private logic is to know how to think that way. It's parallel to empathy. Okay. Then comes the point eventually where you step out of that and then compare this private logic to common sense. That is, you make this comparison. But it's like what you're doing is you're stepping in and you're stepping out.
No, I remember once you talking about the therapist needing to become, I think the words you used, a paradigm of common sense with clients.
Yeah.
I guess this is what you're talking
Eventually,
about.
yeah, what you don't push it into the client's face, but you become a very reliable source of common sense about life. I mean, this is what the parents should have done. They should have interpreted the world realistically and honestly for somebody, okay? The ideal parenting here would be to help the child learn about life. Partly you may tell them a little bit, but Ideally, you question them and help them reach their own conclusions,
Okay.
but that you become a reliable source of what probably will happen in life. How does life work? How do people work? Okay? And if the parents don't do this, then the therapist needs to back that up and become the paradigm of common sense, which is, you know, the way social logic works. Not what absolutely happens, but what probably will happen if you do something. Like, the idea that, if you want to be loved and cared for, there's a very good chance that that will happen if you become a loving person. That's common sense. But somebody who has private sense may say, people won't love you no matter what you do, and so you got to protect yourself, and falling in love is very dangerous. So, nothing ventured, nothing lost. I'm safe. That's common. That's private logic.
I would imagine the more insecure a person is, the deeper the inferiority feeling, the more they're emotionally invested in the private logic and clinging to it.
They cling to the private logic largely not so much out of the insecurity, but because of the goal.
Okay.
The problem with many goals is that since they are fictions and they are exaggerated and they go against social logic, they don't fit common sense. So one has to abandon common sense in order to pursue a goal.
Okay.
You take schizophrenic who abandons common sense entirely, and they want to be God, perhaps. So the inferiority feeling makes it difficult to accept common sense because, common sense says you need to do your part. The person says, I can't, I'm weak, I can't do it, so please excuse me. But the inferiority feeling does not totally exclude common sense. One could recognize that everybody has these kind of feelings. That's possible to get over them. But once you get a goal that is uncooperative and exaggerated and much too high, then you can't live with common sense, because common sense says that this goal is foolish.
Now, we're getting away from, I think we're getting away from creativity, the creative process a little bit. So let's jump back to it, yes. Back there. And what would you, I'm not sure where to go. The question isn't coming to mind, but maybe you could just
talk a little bit more
about
the creative process.
Process.
There's one aspect of creative process I think I began to talk about before, and then we got a little on the sidetrack, and that is the role of feeling in the creative process. Okay. One of the things I noticed was that, and especially doing casework I'm talking about now, that, let's say you have at your fingertips a lot of case information and you've analyzed it. And you've looked for common denominators, and you've looked for connections and contrasts, and you've done a fairly good job of doing, I guess you could say, a analysis and attempting to do a synthesis of it. At some point, you need to make a creative leap, which is, what does all this mean? How do you put this all together? How do you jump and pull out of it the law of movement and the goal? And what I discovered, and this was largely as a result of working with Sophia after these so many, many years and watching, as we discussed cases, I finally realized that what she was doing is she was working very logically, but at the point at which we really got into synthesizing the case and bringing out the goal and the style of life, that she was using feeling to access that knowledge. And then later on, and as I did some studying about the creative process, I realized from the work of Leviel and Gray that their assumption is that we use feelings to organize our thinking.
Now you had mentioned this in one of the previous interviews. Now you said something about just now that you observed Sophia making these intuitive leaps through the use of feeling. Maybe you could paint us a verbal picture of.
Okay. Well, what happens is it's like Sophia. I can tell you my own experience of it, which is was prompted or stimulated by hers, and that is when I'm doing, let's say, a case study seminar, for example, and we're discussing a case, and I'm writing down notes and trying to get a sense of the family constellation, and we're analyzing earliest recollections, and we're spending an hour together, and there's a lot of good thinking going on. There comes a point when I have it down there, and there's sort of a, logically, I understand what's in front of me, but I'm not penetrating to the hidden part yet, okay? What I will do is I will sort of back off my mental concentration and just try to get a feeling for it. It's a shift, it's sort of like maybe like left brain, right brain, I'm not quite sure how to identify it, but it's a shift into a feel. It's like trusting that my feelings will do something with the information that I have here, okay? And that the thinking alone is not enough. And then what will happen is, it's almost like, and I make a joke about this, like I get into a little bit of a trance, but it's not a trance, okay? It's just that there's a kind of a backing off this logical analysis. And then, very frequently, it comes to me. Now, remember Sophia saying, it'll come to you. And that's, I believe what's happening there is that you have enough information, but you're not quite sure how to organize it because there's something missing. What's missing is the right feeling. Okay?
You need to trust yourself at
You
some
must
point. Or,
trust your entire, in fact, just go further. Sometimes it's a feeling and sometimes it's a somatic process. It's like you have a feeling in your gut. Okay?
Physical.
A physical kind of thing. You say, what in the hell is this? You know, about the case. It's not a reaction to it. It's a result of being so deeply involved in it. Okay? Sometimes it's a reaction that is similar to what the client is probably feeling. Okay? But what happens is that immersion in feeling tends to elicit out of nowhere, and it's to me the creative process, a conclusion, an image, an idea, and it really is an aha experience. I can always identify it. You know, I'm sitting here and suddenly we're talking and I can just feel, I'm not getting it, and I just sort of back off and let that feeling come in. Suddenly, it just comes to me. It's not like I squeezed it out, but as I back off, I let this happen, and suddenly an idea comes, and I usually talk about it. But if I'm working on a case, I'll write it down, all right? And in many cases, it's right on the button. But it's not amazing because the fundamental work is there, the preparation is there. It's just that how to organize it. And as much as I've gone through and tried to organize it intellectually, if I stay too cognitive, it doesn't happen. Now, once having done this, I then back up and try to substantiate and prove my point cognitively. Verify it, yeah. That's also part of the creative process. Can you verify your hunch or your illumination, as they put it? I've tried to do this up to a certain point with computer software.
Yeah, if you could talk more about that, I think one of your, it seems like one of your creative pursuits, applications is, I think of you as, I've used this term for you, excuse me, computer monk.
Computer
you
monk?
Spend a lot of time
I'm
at
not
the
dressed properly for it.
Spending a lot of time at the computer, organizing data and analysis. This seems to be part of your personal contribution here. This is something you've added here. Talk about that.
The reason I have done this is that the process of thinking about a case is an elusive one. And what I discovered a long time ago was some of my early guesses were very valuable. And then trying to write them all down and keep track of them got to be sort of a mess of paper. You think you know what I'm talking about here. I got a combination of Post-its and notes in the margin, and I've got this pad with a very wide margin so I can put my comments on the left. And I think it's called a legal notepad, whatever. But I also discovered that not only early guesses, but spending time on flushing out patiently early thinking behind the guesses was also important. Okay? So sometimes I'll make, marginal notes on a set of recollections. Okay? But I realized all of the stuff was very hard to retrieve and organize. It's all on paper. And I have to go back, and then I would highlight with yellow and underline in red and mark in blue and make arrows here, and it looked like hash. But it was working on paper. Then I realized as I was working on a computer, wait a minute, there's a better way. I mean, the computer does not do your thinking for you. There's nothing creative about working on that computer. What it does is it organizes and accesses material very nicely. So what I did is I transferred material to a computer, which is able to organize, database or an outliner, whatever. And then I was able to manipulate that information and rearrange it very easily. Now that was wonderful because rearranging stuff on paper got to be sort of a mess. And then I found that certain programs allowed me to do my thinking on the keyboard and on the screen. So I'd put in the information that I knew about the case, the factual information, okay? And then what I would do is, alongside that, quote, factual information, I would start freely guessing. And this is what Adler told us to do. Take a little bit of information and guess, all right? Well, he had somebody probably making a recording of what he was saying, right? Well, what do we do? If we just guess and don't make a record of it, do we retain it? I don't always. So what I do is I would record my thinking in there, okay, as I went along. Then I would look at my conclusions and look for patterns.
Patterns in your own thinking.
In my own thinking. I would look for patterns in the core material, but then the point is the core material is this big, okay? It's almost unmanageable. So I would start boiling it down in some way, okay? As I boiled it down, I would get to a sort of a compression of it, an abstract of it. That was a little more manageable in scale. Then I would look for the patterns in there, okay? And sometimes, in a way, I guess you call it looking for meta patterns. I would look for initial patterns there, and then I'd look for the patterns of the patterns, okay? And it's working up that tree of looking for the highest common denominator. I guess that's inductive thinking, is that right?
I was getting
Higher
mixed up,
levels of
yeah.
induction, well, whatever. But I found that doing this was fascinating on the computer, and especially using certain software. And I must have experimented with a dozen different software programs, because no program was designed for this purpose, okay? So that's where I got sort of a connection between case analysis and computer work. Like, the computer becomes an assist of the therapist. And it also means as you add in material on a case, new material as it comes along, you can then take that material on the computer very easily and put it into categories or into groups that allow you to examine it much better. Like old material, new material. Like in some case, I was working with somebody with earliest recollections that the person had come back to me after not seeing me for many years. Recollections were 8 years old. I asked her for her latest recollections. She gave them to me, and then I compared them. They were fascinating. They were very similar, but there was a difference, and the difference accounted for her growth. So having those on paper is still possible, but not as convenient or efficient as having this information on the computer. Not everybody likes it, but I find it comfortable.
No, it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. And what do you, as far as computers and therapy and therapists, one of the questions I wanted to ask you, because you really spent so much time developing this in your own personal way of doing things. What do you see in the future for therapy, as far as therapy and computers? And I know you've been involved on the internet also.
There's a lot of activity on the internet now. I try to keep the pulse of it, about doing therapy on the internet. There are people who are now doing it,
Actually doing therapy on the internet, or just...
there's some people who are advertising now they will do therapy on the internet. And somebody will, I think they charge $25 a question or something like that. I mean, it's being done. Okay. There's discussions, there's one research mailing list that is discussing the legitimacy of doing online therapy, because it's not completely secure, you know. Anything,
Right.
any messages you send over the internet.
No confidentiality or little.
Well, it's dicey, yeah. My feeling about that is that there is something inherently missing from that bothers me, which is the person-to-person contact.
Right.
I've experimented with, I guess, online chats and asynchronous communication and ways of, you know, you can type to somebody and they can type back to you and it's live. There is, that to me is not work well, for at least at Larian therapy, which ideally is face-to-face. Now, I have done telephone work, but with people I know very well.
Okay.
And that works okay, but not with a stranger. I can't imagine that. So I think the internet is absolutely wonderful for exchanging information, but not for making a relationship. At present, at least.
You are involved. You are involved with what's it? Is it Behavior Online now?
Yeah.
And you have an exchange going with some other therapists, and do you maybe you just talk about that? That's been something you've been, I think, very kind of involved in.
Yeah, I did it more.
I'm not sure if that's an expression of your creativity that you want to talk about.
Well, it is. It is
important.
an expression because it's a medium that it took me a while to adjust to. I had an opportunity to do an interview on this Behavior Online, which is bringing together a number of disciplines of behavioral sciences. And that led to them creating a discussion forum in which people who signed up or visited the site could ask questions and get answers. And I discovered, after trying this, that the question-answer aspect on the internet was a different medium. It was different than talking to somebody on the phone or writing a letter. There was something different about it. And it took me quite a while to adapt to what I felt was the style of responding to people. Also, you're responding to people you don't know. And sometimes there are, I would say, trap questions, okay, and a lot of wonderful, legitimate questions. But eventually, and it was also difficult to get people to leave questions at first. It was very interesting. Only a few people seemed to have the comfort with the internet to leave their questions. A couple of professionals and almost no students. And finally, I went online and said, students, please ask any questions you want. It doesn't have to be brilliant questions. Ask any questions. It took a while to ferret some questions out. So what's happened is the positive side of this is that people from all over the world are finding out about our work in classical Larian therapy, and it's opening their eyes.
That's
a lot
exciting.
of students really who were trained in a different way are becoming very excited, like, what is this way we never even heard about? So that part is very nice. We also have our home page of the Adler Institute, and very gradually I'm adding more and more materials so people can find out what this is about and what the applications are.
Well, that's exciting. I'm thinking, when we're talking about the creative process and your creative contributions, in my mind, before we began the taping, you had mentioned the creative power of the child. Well, let's talk about creativity. And Adler talked about the creative power of the child and placed that at a very high level in terms of its importance for people to change. And maybe you could talk about that, weave that into.
Adler mentioned it many, many times. As a matter of fact, I was amazed at how many times he used that term, since I have a lot of his material on.
It keeps coming up on the.
It keeps coming up. Every time I search, and there it is. He's talking about creative power. Alexander Mueller talked about it a lot. Sophia talked about it a lot. And the Atlas referred to it as the X factor. And that's, you could look at hereditary, look at environment, you can look at a number of things. But when you look at what causes somebody to choose a certain direction in life, it's this creative power. And that's the property of the individual. Everybody has it. But Atlas said in different amounts. But this does not mean creative power to do artwork. I don't mean that. It's the creative power to deal with situations, and even negative situations, in a way that nobody's thought about before, even as a child. How do you get out of a pickle, out of an uncomfortable, difficult situation, and invent a way out, even though these adults don't know what the hell that they're doing? So that's very optimistic, number one, okay? It also is realistic insofar as people have it in varying degrees, and it's also possible to almost kill that creative power, or to put it underground. Or it's possible to awaken it and bring it out in people.
This is perhaps, at least my understanding, one of the differences between Adlerian psychology and a lot of other psychologies, which may be more deterministic.
Right.
I get a feeling a lot of developmental, more psychoanalytically oriented psychologies, or I don't think they particularly emphasize this.
No, they don't. Although I cannot imagine doing therapy without this assumption. Because look who's here again.
Has to get in her time on the interview.
Kitty, you work well? All right. No.
There you go, sit here. Right.
By the way, she has helped me doing therapy. This was when I was practicing at home many years ago. She had, actually no, excuse me, it wasn't her, it was another cat. Had a great sensitivity to unhappy people, and would come up to them and be very affectionate with them when they were very unhappy. And I would just back off and let it happen. So, anyway.
Okay.
What were we talking about before?
Before the animal
cat,
therapy,
yes.
right? Kitty therapy. The creative power of the child, and Mueller and Sophia
Also
and,
in therapy. One of the aspects of therapy is try to reawaken an individual's creative power.
how do you do that?
Kitty, sweetie, come on.
Okay. Here,
Pardon us.
Okay.
all right.
She seems to intuitively know what the center of a situation is, okay, where the action is. How do you awaken a creative power? Number one, first of all, you're not going to find it if you don't believe it exists. Okay, so it's a matter of a belief and a faith that there is some aspect of this, maybe weak, okay, or in some degree, in each person, in your client, that it was there, in the sense, if you can trace it, that it was there in the beginning to develop the original lifestyle or prototype of the lifestyle. And it's still there as a possibility for the individual to make a change or a leap out of their lifestyle, to make something quite brand new. Now, in order to bring it out, one has to first do a lot of, I would say, foundation work, diminishing the inferiority feeling, the insecurity, loosening that goal, which is very distorting. The goal, the whole presence of the goal, in the sense, is uncreative. It's repetitive, compulsive. I must do this. This is the most important thing. That's not very creative. It would be clever how you get there, but it's not creative. The creative aspect is when you loosen up from that and let go of it, and that you can then almost like create out of nothing.
You said as you began this a few moments ago, if you can trace it back the beginning to the beginning of creative power, what would you look for in somebody's early recollections or in their histories? What kind of movements?
You mean that would illustrate the presence of the creative power?
Yeah. What would you? Yeah. What does?
Good point. Okay.
Okay.
What is promising in early recollections is when an individual is active and struggles to deal with something, perhaps that's difficult or frustrating, and doesn't give up. They try one way and they try another way, and then they finally find a way. That is sort of an element of the creative power, a combination of courage and determination and activity.
So it would be less optimistic if someone were more passive and things just happened to them instead of...
Passive, just lying there, waiting for everything to fall out of heaven, maybe being sad, or maybe being happy, being taken care of. I mean, you could say that the creative power can be practically destroyed in a child in a number of different ways. One way is make everything that they do wrong. Stop that. Don't do that. You know, cut that out. Don't experiment. Don't, you know, listen to me and do as I say. The demand for compliance. That's, you know, and if you don't, you get punished. All right. But there's another, maybe not so expected way of killing the creative power, and that's indulgence. When you pamper a child, when you do too much for a child, you completely wipe, because the child then believes you can take care of it, you will handle it, you will take care of what's difficult. I don't need to invent.
Okay. Child doesn't have to struggle.
Doesn't have to struggle. I'm talking now about the creative power as applied to living, not, you know, to artwork or music or dance or anything like that, but to living. It's being creative about one's difficulties, about one's circumstances, struggling with it, and learning that you... The important thing here is that you learn by struggling with things, and maybe you need some encouragement, that you can come up with something new that you didn't know before. Now, isn't that encouraging? And you can do it again and again and again. Now, the thing with a child is you can't make the challenge too big, okay? It has to be reasonable size, but it has to be something new.
Which maybe has implications also for doing therapy and awakening that creative power, beginning with small steps.
You begin with small steps, and the person finds that they can be successful, and that they also struggle with simple questions and problems, okay? And they try them out, and they discover through trial and error that they can make mistakes and correct them. Now, that's another important part, is the awareness that you can make mistakes, no problem, and that you can correct them, no problem, no humiliation, no big deal. And that if you keep doing that, you will become creative. Trial and error.
I remember Sophia once making the statement over and over again, mistakes teach you what you need to know.
The mistakes are your friends. I tell that to children.
Oh.
They give me a look.
Right.
It's all right.
Any more? You know, this whole area of creativity, interests me. And what do you see in your work with therapists, training therapists, about kind of awakening creativity in therapy, or in therapists? Could you address that?
Yeah. I see in the early work with a therapist, there has to be a kind of a mastering of the basics, so it's not yet necessarily creative. And one may initially be very much influenced by the style of one's mentor or a teacher or teachers one's working with. But that's fine. One has to kind of get the feeling of it and get a sense of it. If one also, as a therapist, works on oneself, on personality, and does a study analysis, and overcomes the, I guess, lifestyle limitations, it reaches a point eventually where the individual has confidence in themselves and their technique or their approach, okay? And in a sense, they have information, they're well trained, but they also have a good feeling about themselves as people. There are no contradictions, they're not defensive about it. At that point, the individual is able to do the therapy in their very own unique way, which is not so terribly different than, let's say, another person trained in the same way. I mean, the principles are the same. It's like, as I watch Kurt Adler work, as I watch Sophia work, as I watch Anthony work, okay? It's, you know, three different people, three different styles. But in each of them, there was an absolutely iron core of the same theory, the same philosophy, and that same feeling about working. But they were working creatively in their own way.
Well, could you give examples of your experience with these three therapists in that regard? If you... to make it clear.
Okay, Sophia, for example, her style was exquisitely Socratic insofar as she took that art of Socratic questioning and raised it, to a very high level. And her way of finding the right questions to ask people, and then helping them see the consequences, unequaled. I've never seen anyone quite do it that way. It's quite marvelous. Yet she was using the theory, very clearly, exactly the way Adler said it needed to be used. But that was her particular leaning, her skill. Also, remember, she was trained in Europe. She was initially a teacher, so there was that. And there was a Socratic style of teaching in Europe. Antony working. Antony did not use that questioning approach so much. Antony loved using diagrams. He loved simplifying things. He loved telling little stories. He had a kind of, remember, Sophia was Dutch. Okay, Antony was Romanian, but had a Viennese quality to him. Antony's approach was full of humor and simplicity. Okay, and every once in a while he'd draw little V's, and he'd show you a picture and so on, and he'd tell you a little story. And he'd talk about our friend Jim, who's that? That's you, Okay. He'd make up words.
Invent words.
He'd invent his own words, but that had a very stimulating effect. Like, what are you talking about? Catch your attention. What is that word? And there was a very appealing quality, but it was his own way. And he also he was the first Larry I knew of who did therapy by mail.
Therapy by mail.
By mail, yeah. He also was a master of brief therapy, largely because of his way of living. He did a lot of traveling, okay, and he'd go from place to place. And then there's Kurt Adler. I've seen Kurt work. Kurt gets right to the point, and there is a kind of a getting to the essentials with Kurt. Like, he doesn't waste any time at all. Now, he doesn't do the kind of the questioning that Sophia does in the same way. He doesn't use Antony's, but he gets to you directly, maybe very much like his father did, okay? But there's also that lovely sense of humor with Kurt. But if you look at all three of these people, there is that feeling of being connected, that feeling of community that Adler talked about. There is a gentleness, there is a kind of warmth in them.
Mueller would call it contactability, I guess.
Yeah, and there is no contradiction between what they're saying and how they are and how they're acting. There's a congruence in each of these people. But there is a kind of a feeling of uniqueness. Okay. Now, if you look at the uniqueness of each therapist's style, okay, you say, well, okay, you're going to do it this way. Does that mean that you treat each person the same way? No. So you have the therapist's uniqueness. Now, talk about creativity. Now a big door opens up. Every client you see has to be treated differently,
You talked
using your uniqueness.
You talked earlier, I think in another interview, about inventing a therapy for each client. We were talking about the training of therapists.
Which makes it fascinating. I can't imagine some therapies that use a by the numbers 1, 2, 3, ABC, how boring that would be over a period of time. Okay? We're using typologies. How boring. I think I would go to sleep, okay, during that kind of therapy. But here, it's like every client comes in. There is a brand new lifestyle to discover, and there is a brand new form of therapy to invent using these principles.
Now, in bringing this back to you, are there other things you feel you have brought to the practice of Adlerian therapy in terms of your own creativity? I know you've done some marathon work. You mentioned that, and you've mentioned missing experience and eidetic imagery for effective change.
Yeah, I think when I was developing these ideas, I would, I guess I worked with Sophia almost 30 years. I would check with her and say, I'd like to try this year. And basically what she would say is that you can be very creative in an Adlerian way. So with eidetic imagery, for example, I became familiar with the work of Achta Assen, who wrote on eidetic imagery. He did a sort of a diagnostic technique and a therapeutic technique. The diagnostic part seemed quite fascinating to me, and so I started working with it. And although I didn't completely accept his full technique, I found that from an Adlerian standpoint, it was possible using imagery, a person's images of, and which is different than early memories, okay? Because images, very vivid images of particular people, which get more and more vivid through a certain amount of guided suggestion, okay? That these images revealed a great deal of, I would say, unconscious information, or information that was maybe hard for the person to put into words honestly, but it was easier to put into an image because they didn't realize the significance of the image, okay?
Could you give an example, or does any example come to mind when you talk about how would you
well, for
use
example,
this?
I'll ask somebody to get an image, let's say, of a parent, of just a picture of their face. And I'm not asking for a particular memory, but just an image that would come to mind. After the person is reasonably relaxed, then I would ask them to describe the face that they see and the expression on the face. Then I'd ask them to look at the eyes and say, what do the eyes seem to express? What does the mouth? So by going into details, it's almost like a projective test. And the person then begins to create things that reveal attitude and feelings. Does the person, have the person say something? Okay, what is their posture? Now, this is very difficult for a person unless they are, let's say, trained as a dancer or a mime, to sort of fake this. But what happens is the individual then is able to give me some information that may confirm what they've said or go a little deeper. Now, at some point, what I may discover is that these images are quite negative and have, that create a very strong aversion response in the person. Therapeutically, what we may do at some point, this missing experience, is to create alternative images that create a more positive feeling. Now, the marathon work was something I studied with a man named Joe Potts, which was, how do you, what can you do in a group setting in a very concentrated way, using some very special techniques? And I found, after doing some exploration, that when people were ready, the marathon was a marvelous setting, because usually when I did a marathon, I had at least one or more therapists. Usually my wife, who was trained in therapy, was a co-leader of the group, but I had maybe one more therapist in the group, plus some other people who've had varying degrees of experience. And so what we had were people who could do, I guess you might say, a variation of psychodrama. But some of the work was not just to illustrate a problem. Some of the work was to create a solution. So the missing experience may have been the person may have needed a particular experience of, let's say, even being reparented at a certain age, but it would be inappropriate for me to play that role. But if I have a volunteer who can play the role and do something, then it works very well. But it's not something that I might necessarily attempt in a 1-hour therapy session, because there'd be not enough time to debrief. So here it would we have a 12-hour day, lots of time.
This is a natural outgrowth, perhaps, of your interest in drama and therapy.
Absolutely.
And
so that's another point. Yeah,
theater.
That made it comfortable for me. The connection between theater, psychodrama, therapy. What could I do that seemed very comfortable for me, and that did actually achieve the result? And there's some dramatic results in there, no question about it.
So, being faithful to Adler's principles. Not being eclectic in any regard there, but perhaps at a certain technique level, being eclectic, drawing on being eclectic in the sense of drawing on other from other places, but adapting it to Adlerian principles.
Different people who have done some quite excellent, interesting work in different therapies. I have absolutely no question about that. Fascinating stuff. I'm not eclectic theoretically or philosophically. Okay, So if I take a technique and I happen to use it, like take the Gestalt technique of the empty chair, I don't use it like a Gestalt therapist. I use it like an Adlerian. Marino, psychodrama techniques, there are certain things he would do. I don't use it like Marino, but I will adapt it to an Adlerian flavor. And so the idea of what is the theoretical structure and what are we going for in terms of improvement and cure is very different. So, in a sense, I'm open to being influenced by good work of anybody. I remember Jack Rosberg when I first saw him and how he...
Jack Rosberg down in Southern California.
Southern California,
Okay.
the Ansippi Institute, worked with psychotic patients. And I saw a demonstration of how that man, or sort of video, of how he entered the world of psychotic patients. It was extraordinary. Now, there are very few people who can do it that way, and I wouldn't recommend that people just learn to do it. I mean, that man was able to do it, and it illustrated something. And it, I didn't plan to do it his way, but it gave me, in a sense, a springboard to say, now, what is an Adlerian way? I mean, to give you an example. If one were to try to enter the world of a psychotic patient, let's say, who thought he was Jesus, okay, and you wanted to get close to him, there are a number of ways that you could enter that world. You could enter that world as God, right? True?
I
And you could have
suppose.
a dialogue with the person. But an Adlerian might choose to enter that world at an equal or lower level.
With God or the patient?
With the patient.
With the patient.
Instead
okay.
of coming in as God,
Okay,
as a
okay,
disciple
okay.
of Jesus.
Okay. Okay. All right.
For a particular reason. And then, now, what was interesting is that, what's the justification for doing this? Justification is connection.
Okay.
If he won't let you in as anybody else, maybe let you in as a
Peter
disciple,
or
Peter
Paul.
or Paul. But then he can also watch you get out of it. I thought it was quite interesting.
Okay. We're out of time. Again,
No.
this is flown.
You're kidding.
This is flown by, and with a couple of interruptions.
Well, our guest Kat
our
probably
guest
took
Kat,
up
and maybe we could do this again. So I thought this was going to be the last one, but I don't think so.
it's beginning to sound like the X-Files. Thank you, Jim.
Okay.